In this video, we are going to be looking at a few different texts that are very old, and these give us an idea of true human history versus the mostly fictional corporate history of today. In the book Voyage chez différentes nations sauvages de l'Amérique septentrionale by J. Long, trader and interpreter of Indian languages, translated from the English with notes and additional interests by JBLJ Villacoco. And this is edition is 1794. Now on page 57, it states that the Iroquois laughed when they heard talk of obedience to kings. They could not reconcile the idea of submission with the dignity of man. Each individual, in their eyes, was sovereign in their opinion, and how it could not come about that liberty, and essentially this part is stating that it was the Great Spirit only that gave liberty, and that they would not recognize any other power. Now, this writer is taking from a previous passage, which he cites below with context, and also gives us the name of the book that he's quoting from, which is a much earlier work called the Voyages de Lahontan, or Lahontan, second volume, chapter 5, page 36 and 37. And this one, in even older French, states that these peoples were free through all that was understood of the right, natural right, and liberty the same. And it was, I believe this is stated that it was this way throughout all the land. And they laughed, nor did they. Well, in this bottom part, it's interesting because the first writer translated the one part that they could not reconcile the idea of submission with the dignity of man. But the original writer stated that they could not reconcile the idea of submission with the truth of man, or with the true man, which would have to do with the identity of humanity. And that the term dependence horrified them. Interesting part there. But at least the first writer did leave context to where he was quoting from, so a person could make their own translation. And it's interesting because this later French writer is translating from even earlier French, and few of us today are taught how these words were used at the time, and a lot of divining from context is required, but still we might even misunderstand and misinterpret what was being taught before, because virtually nobody is actually taught linguistics or language today. However, these contexts give a stark contrasting image to the corporate fictional propaganda that we're fed in the school corporate employee machine called the corporate employee mill, which we call the school system, in which we're told that Christopher Columbus, when he arrived in the Americas, or rather discovered the Americas, was met with adulation and worship. That's illogical, considering the way that the so-called savages thought. Not to mention, this word savage comes from the French sauvage, which actually means wild. It's like salvaje in Spanish, means wild. So the corrupt corporate representatives conflated the word on purpose because they despised those that laughed at kings. And then in the book that was cited, we find other interesting anecdotes. In Les Mémoires de l'Amérique septentrionale ou la suite des voyages de Monsieur le Baron de Lahontan, this is that, and with a dictionary in the language of the country. This is Pies. And this is the second edition from 1728. Now, this writer states that Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey was referring to the Eskimo when he talked about the Cyclops. And then this writer highlights 4 passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey in ancient Greek, which I do not read or understand, so I can't translate that. But it is interesting that he makes that connection for us. Then this book also mentions a name which I have not seen anywhere, called Frederick Onschild, which is interesting because there's a particularly corrupt individual in history called Ansel Rothschild. And who knows if there's a connection or not, but that's an interesting name that I can't find mentioned anywhere else. Could be worth looking into. Next, there's a passage that talks about 2 particular nations that I've also never heard of and is hard to find mention anywhere else of. And those are the 2 nations of the Talon and the Sable. Although it's possible that, well, it does say de la nation du Talon et du Sable. So it could be talking about a single nation of the Talon and the Sable. And it says that the Ottawas of that nation, basically stating that the Ottawas were of a different nation. So it's interesting, perhaps the writer is using the term nation in a different way than we might understand today, in contrast to the corporate definition that we're all fed through the employee machine. Now, in a book titled De Lisboa a Mozambique, Cartas, this is from Lisbon. Lisboa is Lisbon in Portuguese. To Mozambique, letters to don't remember what that means, but it was written by Alfredo Brandal Cruz G. Castro Ferretti, who was the governor of Sofala. It's from Geographic Society of Lisbon, and from this Writers and Hispanic Artists of Madrid. And this book is from 1884, or at least it was published then. And then on page 139 of this book, we get a passage that explains a situation that is all too familiar for most of us today. And it states that the Sultan it was said that the Sultan was descendant of the Caliphs of Cordoba, and affirmed that the ancestors came from the Iberic Peninsula. And this, of course, is the Sultan of Zanzibar, what we would refer to as Tanzania today, or most of us might. But it said that also in this page that the harem, like all other Oriental seraglio, which is like a palace, is closed to foreigners, and its own indigenous that cannot look at its windows, in consequence of the punishments that would be applied to anyone, mostly used that took the opportunity or the audacity to look at the favorites of the Sultan. Of course, those are favorite women. Of course, the harems in actuality were mostly just places that the sultan's family would be, including children, although it's usually represented as a house of prostitutes, which is highly inaccurate. And it was that as the indigenous were not allowed, the Europeans that looked with a great discernment, or descaramento, I don't remember what that means, to that building where enclosed were true beauties. So basically the Indians could not look at the harem, but the Europeans did without castigation. And this sultan is from Cordoba, and the sultan of Zanzibar, or Tanzania now, is currently the sultan of Oman, allegedly. And this way that it's presented, how the harem is treated or defended, really contrasts to the independent sultans of the Ottoman Empire, or the old Ottoman Empire, who would fire on ships for getting too close and would execute anyone for looking in that direction. So it's interesting that they would castigate the indigenous, but not the Europeans, which really tells you how independent that sultan really was, or still is. In another page, we get more clarification. On 129, it states that the troop, or the, I believe that's a military unit, but the troop of the front line used all white uniforms with a English bonnet with incarnata, I think that's not incarnation, that's well, it had a yellow line. The 12 companies that consisted of 2 battalions had a respective number on the bonnet. So essentially they had their battalion and company numbers on their hats. Each battalion had a English official or officer as a commandant, and the 2 battalions were below a commanding general of the English officer Matthews. This officer that was captain of the English army had under the Sultan the post of colonel, with a payment of 60 libras, which would be pounds, monthly, and a house given by His Highness, which was the Sultan. This a capable official and other captain that co-helped. Well, basically, this paragraph is stating that the armies of the Sultan in Zanzibar, who is the Sultan of Ottoman, who came from Cordoba, were English. Their officers were English. So let's look at the makeup of these militaries, and we'll get even more clarification. On our next page, which is page 128, it says, Zanzibar, thanks to the impulse that the advantage of iron of the Sultan was given to him. That's basically stating that because he had so at the time modern armaments, that he had an advantage, and because of this advantage is on the path of progress. And we can, well, the rest of this part is just talking about the progress. The part that's really important says the army was divided in the first line, body of, or corporal, which is corpo, or corps. Most of the time we use corps. The corps of Persians, elite Persians, Saipaus. The first line counted 2 battalions of infantry divided into 6 companies. The corps of the elite having 2 companies with 60 processes, I believe that's places. I'm not sure what it is in this context. It's a unit of force. And the Saipaus of the capital garrison had a quantity of 360 men. Basically, the important part of this is that the army, while it was made up of Saipos, which are foreigners, and Persians, were obviously not from Zanzibar, and were commanded by English captains instead of being captains of the Sultan from Oman, which is interesting. But further, in a different page on 134, we get more context, and it said that the streets of Zanzibar were in general straight. And some of them were good shops, being in the majority from sons of Goa. The colony, or the Portuguese colony in Zanzibar, made up of Canarines and big. Surgeons, fayetes, pharmacists, druggists, shoemakers, etc., all Portuguese. In Zanzibar, there was a surgeon of the Goa school, many dear residents, and not only their excellent qualities, but also, but equally, through the operations and knowledge of medical knowledge. It was the College of the Sultan. Of course, this situation presents itself today in an all too familiar practice of sending mercenaries from one place, such as the United States or the Americas, to another place like Iraq, and taking the people that should be defending that place and moving them to the home of those that had been sent to go and attack and burn their homes. So it's all just a bunch of moving pieces around to kill each other and cause chaos. Basically, what was alive in Zanzibar at the time is still alive today and taking place in all of our homes, where all the people that are supposed to be defending the various shores are sent away to attack somebody else's home, while those people are sent to attack the homes of the first people that were sent to attack them. And that is global corruption at its worst. Now, this very statement can be found in that highly corporate document, the Declaration of Independence of the U.S. corporation. And when we go to the archives.gov website, it states in the Declaration of Independence certain grievances, and these grievances are listed of the people, but they are shifting liability to a king far away, so that way the people that are practically instigating these things won't be held accountable. And the one grievance which perfectly points out the viewpoint of the writers of this Declaration of Independence is in the last grievance, in which it states he has excited, that's talking about the king, domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now, the first thing in this part that we should note is the general contempt for the so-called Indian savages, which that contempt would come out of loyalist writers who like to be obedient to kings and dislike the derision that the Iroquois had for the practice of obedience and submission to kings. And the other portion of this that really tells you the perspective of the writers is how they claim to be representatives of us and to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers. That's similar to the people who will stake claim over others' children, stating that the children of our community need to be protected. So in this one passage, you recognize what the perspective of the writers of the Declaration of Independence are. They are essentially just corporate shills or puppets of the Crown Corporation, attempting to divert liability away from the practical application of tyranny to a king that's very far away and out of reach, as they like to do today so often. However, in other grievances, they do recognize and list some of the grievances that the people had at the time, and of course still have today. In this grievance, it states, he is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. Again, shifting liability and also suggesting that the King of England is personally transporting mercenaries. No, those mercenaries are being let in by these very people, and still do today by our so-called representatives. And it also states, he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretend legislation. Now, the first thing we should note in this one is that this states our Constitution. Which Constitution are they talking about? Because the Constitution of the United States corporate government was allegedly ratified in 1794, which would have allegedly been after this Declaration of Independence. And it also states that he has combined with others to subject us. That language, combined, is used in the letter that Lincoln made where he usurped the authority, or attempted to, well, I suppose in actuality he did, but he usurped the authority of the marshals, civil marshals, which we don't have anymore. And in that letter, Lincoln, or allegedly Lincoln, used the word combinations that were being assembled. So it's almost like the apple does not fall far from the tree. And in the next one, it states, in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Well, in that last part, the correct response would be, yeah, what else is new? Obviously, if you have a prince, he's not ruling a free people. That's stating the obvious there. And then in the first part, that is once again shifting responsibility, just like the politicians today who repeatedly ignore the petitions of citizens and complaints, which they are just corporate shills, so of course they're not going to really do anything. They simply just shift the buck and blame somebody else. And that's what's happening here, as with all of these. Next, it states, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Again, our people. Stating ownership. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising conditions of new appropriations of lands. All of that is going on right now under the visa system, under the occupation forces, and the purchasing of frontier property such as the U.S. southern border, property of the United Nations. And essentially, these representatives, so-called, were doing the same thing then as they are doing now, and as always, shift liability somewhere else. Next, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. That sounds a lot like exactly what happens today. Speeding tickets, fines, public disturbance, control, just long list of things that directly apply to that grievance, which was shifting liability. And then for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. And that also happens today by the very people that pretend to be our representatives. Now, the organizing documents perfectly explain the context of what this so-called U.S. government is, which is an incorporated subsidiary of the United Nations company. And the first article that we often see are called the Articles of Association. Now, if you look up what an Articles of Association is, you will get the Articles of Incorporation. They're basically the same thing. Then you have the Resolution for Independency. Again, these documents do not sound like they're made by someone independent of another nation. They sound like documents that are following the regulation of corporations. They are corporate regulatory documents made at the behest of a corporate system, such as the Articles of Confederation, and then last, the Constitution of 1787. Constitution meaning to constitute or to make. The Articles of Association, as according to Wikipedia, in corporate governance, a company's Article of Association is a document which, along with the Memorandum of Association, form the company's constitution and defines the responsibilities of the directors, the kind of business to be undertaken, and the means by which the shareholders exert control over the board of directors. And so there you have it. That is what the U.S. government is. It is a corporation which has a board of directors and shareholders that dictate to those board of directors, and then the board of directors dictates to the executive. And then we, as stated in all of their grievances, are their people, meaning their property. And that puts everything into context.